It was the kind of road trip that should have been nothing more than a peaceful drive across familiar landscapes, a chance to escape the everyday and enjoy the open road. But the moment my stepson sat next to me in the car, I felt the weight of an unspoken tension between us. It wasn't the first time we'd shared a ride, but it felt different this time. The air was thick with something neither of us dared to mention, something that had been building up for months, maybe even years. We were on our way to a family gathering, nothing extravagant, just a simple weekend away. But as we drove through the winding roads, with the sun setting on the horizon, I couldn't help but feel the distance between us. For a long time, he and I had been distant, almost like strangers living under the same roof. He was always quiet, withdrawn, and I couldn't quite figure out how to break through that wall he'd built up. In the past, I tried reaching out, but every attempt seemed to fall flat. As the miles stretched on, I couldn't help but glance at him from the corner of my eye. He was staring out the window, his mind clearly elsewhere. I wondered if he even noticed I was there, or if he even cared. The silence between us was deafening, but just when I thought the moment would pass without anything changing, something unexpected happened. He turned to me with a question, one that seemed simple but cut deeper than I ever expected. It wasn't just a casual inquiry. It was a crack in the armor he'd been wearing for so long. I could feel my heart race. Was this the opening I'd been waiting for? Was he finally ready to talk? But just as I was about to respond, the car hit a bump in the road, jolting us both and breaking the moment. The question hung in the air, unanswered. And in that silence, I knew this trip would turn into something much more than a simple getaway. Something was about to change between us. But what would it be? That's where our story picks up. And the rest? Well, it's something I'm still trying to figure out. The next few minutes passed in a blur. I could feel the tension simmering in the car, and I kept glancing at him, hoping he'd say something, anything. But instead, he kept his gaze fixed on the road ahead, as if trying to avoid the moment altogether. The question he had started to ask still lingered in my mind, making me wonder what he had really wanted to know. Was it something about me, about his mom, or was it just a random thought? I couldn't tell, but it felt important, important enough that I couldn't let it slip away. Growing up, things hadn't always been easy for him. I knew that much. He'd lost his father at a young age, and for a long time, it was just him and his mom. They had a bond that was strong, but when she remarried, everything changed. At first, I didn't know how to fit in. I wasn't the perfect stepdad. I didn't have the right words, and I didn't know how to connect with him. Maybe I still didn't, but I never stopped trying. I never stopped hoping that one day he'd see me as more than just the guy his mom married. I could feel it in the way he looked at me sometimes, like he was still sizing me up, deciding if he could trust me, if he should even try to let me in. It was frustrating. I wanted so badly to be the father figure he needed, but the distance between us seemed to grow with each passing year. Every time I thought we were making progress, something would happen to push us back to square one. We hit a stretch of road that was quieter, the streetlights dimming as the countryside took over. The silence was back, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just empty space between us. It was like the car had become a small universe where all the unspoken words and emotions swirled around, neither of us daring to let them out. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer than before. Do you ever wonder if things could be different? The question hung in the air, but it wasn't just about our relationship. It felt deeper, like it was about everything. His words caught me off guard, and I didn't know how to answer. Was he asking if I regretted marrying his mom? Or was he questioning something bigger, something about his place in this family? My mind raced, but before I could respond, he turned away, looking out the window again. The moment had passed, and we were back in that uncomfortable silence, and yet, somehow, I knew it wasn't over. Something had shifted, even if we hadn't spoken it aloud. The miles stretched on, and the quiet between us deepened. I could feel the weight of my stepson's question lingering in the air, unresolved, as if it was something neither of us knew how to address. His gaze stayed fixed out the window, and I couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking. Was he struggling with the same thoughts I was? Did he feel the tension between us, the unspoken conflict that seemed to live in every shared silence? I glanced over at him again, trying to read his face. He wasn't a kid anymore, not the little boy I'd met all those years ago. Now he was almost a man, but there was something in his eyes that told me he was still carrying a lot of weight. A weight that wasn't entirely mine to understand, but that I felt responsible for. What had he been through that I hadn't seen? What battles had he fought in his own mind, with his father's absence and his mother's new life with me? I knew that we both lived in the shadow of his father's memory, and I couldn't deny the impact it had on everything. I could sense that my presence in his life, while not unwanted, had always been a reminder of what he had lost. For years, I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that time would heal the wounds. But what if it wasn't that simple? What if, deep down, he resented me for stepping into a role that was never mine to begin with? What if I was just a substitute for something he would never get back? We turned onto a smaller road, surrounded by dense trees that blocked the light from the setting sun. The darkness seemed to settle around us, but it wasn't just the night that felt heavy. It was the space between us, thick with unspoken words. I wanted to ask him what was going on in his mind, but part of me was afraid to know. I didn't know if I could handle the truth or if it would push him further away. But at the same time, I knew that if I didn't ask, nothing would ever change. The car's headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the road ahead, but it felt like we were driving into a kind of emotional fog. I couldn't help but wonder if this trip, this road we were on, was more than just about getting to our destination. Was it a test? A way for us to confront everything we had been avoiding? The thought gnawed at me, but I still had no idea how it would all unfold. He shifted slightly in his seat, and I couldn't tell if he was going to say something or not. I held my breath, hoping this moment wouldn't slip away again. But then, just as quickly, the quiet returned. The weight of the question remained unanswered, and I knew that whatever came next, we were nowhere near reaching a resolution. The road ahead seemed endless, the darkness creeping in, wrapping around us as we continued driving. The tension in the car was unbearable. I could feel my heart racing, thumping against my chest with every passing minute. The silence had grown oppressive, and yet, every time I thought I might break it, something held me back. It was as if we were both waiting for the right moment, waiting for the courage to speak the words we were both so afraid to say. I kept stealing glances at him, his face still turned away from me, lost in his own thoughts. I wanted to ask him again about what was really going on in his head, but I knew it wasn't just about me. It was about the complicated web of emotions he carried with him every day. Grief, resentment, confusion, all tangled up inside. I knew the absence of his father wasn't something I could fix, no matter how hard I tried. I could never replace that, and sometimes I wondered if he resented me for even trying. But what was I supposed to do? Pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't? The car's tires hummed against the road, and for a moment I thought maybe I could breathe again. But just as I began to feel a tiny flicker of relief, he spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a sharp knife. "Do you think things could ever be normal again?" His question hung in the air, heavy with a mix of vulnerability and something else I couldn't quite place. His eyes finally met mine, and in that instant, I saw something I hadn't noticed before, a flicker of fear. Was he afraid of what I might say? Or was he afraid of what he might have to confront within himself? I swallowed hard, unsure of how to answer. The question wasn't just about our relationship, it was about everything. About the life we'd tried to build, about the fractured bond between him and me, and about the unresolved grief that still lingered in the space between us. Could anything ever go back to the way it was? Was there even a chance for us to move forward, to heal? The car swerved slightly as I took my eyes off the road for a second, but I quickly corrected it. My hands gripped the wheel tighter. The weight of his question pressed down on me, and for a split second, I wondered if I had been wrong all along. Maybe there wasn't a way to fix this. Maybe no matter how hard I tried, we were both just too broken. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The road ahead was dark, uncertain. And yet, as we neared a small, secluded area, I knew something was about to happen. Something was finally going to break between us, and it felt like it was coming at full speed. No brakes, no way to stop. I held my breath, not knowing if this was the moment everything would change, or if it would just slip through my fingers again. The car continued to roll down the winding road, the silence now thick with the weight of everything unspoken between us. The question my stepson had asked still lingered, but something else, something more urgent, began to gnaw at the edges of my thoughts. The unease I had been pushing down started to bubble up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in this moment, that something was watching us, waiting. The trees on either side of the road grew denser, casting long, twisted shadows across the path. I glanced in the rearview mirror, feeling a chill run down my spine when I saw a set of headlights approaching from behind. I didn't think much of it at first, but something felt off. The car behind us seemed to be moving faster, too fast for the narrow, winding road we were on. I could hear the hum of its engine, growing louder, closer, and a knot formed in my stomach. For a split second, I considered pulling over to let the other car pass, but something made me hesitate. The headlights behind us flickered, just for a moment, before they flashed again. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, and I could feel the tension building in the pit of my stomach. I glanced at my stepson, who was now looking nervously out the side window, his hands gripping his seat as if he, too, could sense the growing discomfort. "Who's behind us?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, trying to sound calm, but the truth was, I had no idea. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random driver. There was something too deliberate about their movements, the way they seemed to stay just close enough to make me uncomfortable, but never close enough to clearly see their intentions. The car behind us accelerated again, forcing me to step on the gas just to keep some distance between us. I wasn't about to let anyone intimidate me on this empty stretch of road. But then, just as I was about to make a sharp turn, the other car did something that froze me in place. The headlights blazed bright, temporarily blinding me as they shot forward and suddenly swerved into our lane. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively swerved to avoid a collision. But in that split second, everything changed. The road ahead, which had seemed so familiar just moments ago, now felt like an endless expanse of uncertainty. I fought to regain control of the car as it skidded across the gravel shoulder, the tires screeching in protest. My stepson gasped beside me, his hand reaching out to steady himself. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted, his fear obvious now, breaking through the calm facade I had tried so hard to maintain. I could barely focus on anything other than the fact that we were no longer on the road we had been traveling. We had veered off track completely. I slammed on the brakes, and the car jolted to a halt just inches away from a thick line of trees that seemed to rise out of nowhere. The engine stuttered and died, leaving us in eerie silence, broken only by our heavy breathing. For a moment, everything was still. I didn't know whether to stay put or to take off running. But when I finally gathered the courage to look around, the headlights from the car that had been tailing us had disappeared. There was nothing but the darkness stretching endlessly around us. My heart raced. Had we imagined it? Had I misread the situation? But then I saw it. A figure standing in the distance, just beyond the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It was too far to see clearly, but the silhouette looked too deliberate, too out of place. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, and whatever had just happened wasn't over. Something was about to unfold, something I wasn't prepared for, and whatever it was coming for us. The figure in the distance didn't move, but its presence was enough to send a chill down my spine. My mind raced, wondering who or what it could be. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles away from any other cars, and the only thing surrounding us was the dense forest. I reached for the door handle, my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to get out, check the situation, but my legs felt like lead. My stepson's voice broke the silence, his words thick with fear. "Dad, what is that? Who's out there?" I didn't know how to answer him. I didn't know who was out there, but I sure as hell didn't want to find out. I glanced at him, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. He was looking at the same figure I was. We were both paralyzed by it, unsure of the next move. I reached over to start the engine again, praying the car would respond. It hesitated for a moment before sputtering to life. The sound of the engine made my breath catch, but as I shifted the gear, ready to pull away, I saw the figure move. It was slow at first, but then it broke into a run toward us, faster than I expected. My heart skipped a beat, and I slammed the gear into drive, slamming my foot on the pedal. The car lurched forward, tires screeching as I sped away, my stepson clutching the seat in panic. The trees blurred past us as the dark figure grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but I didn't dare let up on the gas. I could feel the weight of the moment, the tension thick in the air. We were almost out of danger, or so I thought. Just as I breathed a sigh of relief, the headlights from the car that had been tailing us flickered back into view, but this time they were blindingly close. I had no time to react before it rammed into us. The jolt of impact sent us both forward, the seatbelts the only thing preventing us from being thrown. For a moment, everything was a blur. The world spun, and the sounds of metal crunching and glass shattering filled my ears. I struggled to regain control of the car, but it was too late. We were stopped, the car wedged against a tree. My head throbbed as I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but the world around me was spinning. Then, just as I began to focus, the door to the car opened. A figure stepped inside. My heart stopped, but as I turned to face it, I couldn't believe my eyes. It wasn't some stranger or a threat. It was someone I knew. My wife, her eyes wide with urgency, crouched beside me. "You've been trying to fix this for so long, haven't you?" she whispered, her voice a mix of concern and relief. "Mom?" My stepson's voice cracked, disbelief and confusion filling the air. "What the hell is going on?" She glanced at both of us, her expression tight as she pulled out a small device from her pocket. The screen glowed with a familiar pattern, one that I recognized from a conversation we had years ago. The truth hit me like a ton of bricks. The entire situation, the strange car following us, the unsettling feeling in the air, it had all been orchestrated. She had been trying to make us face the truth, force us into a confrontation, and now we were finally facing it. My stepson stared at my wife in shock, his confusion written all over his face. You knew about all this? He asked, his voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and anger. She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. I didn't know how to make it happen, but you two needed to talk. You needed to confront everything you've been avoiding. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what she was saying. It was hard to wrap my head around the idea that this whole ordeal, the strange car following us, the tense moments between me and my stepson, wasn't random. It had been orchestrated, planned carefully to bring us to this moment. You set all this up? My stepson's voice broke, and for the first time, I saw the walls he had built around himself start to crack. I didn't know how else to get you both to open up, she said softly. You've been dancing around your issues for years, and I've watched you both struggle in silence. I had to do something. I could see the weight of her words sink in. She wasn't trying to hurt us. She was trying to push us toward healing, even if it meant tearing down the walls we had so carefully built. It was difficult to swallow, to accept that everything we had been avoiding had been carefully set in motion, but it made sense now. Every moment of tension between me and my stepson, every awkward silence, it wasn't just about him not accepting me as a father figure. It was about everything we hadn't said to each other, the things we had been too afraid to confront. My stepson turned to me, his face softened, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, confusion, and, finally, vulnerability. You know, I never wanted to make this harder than it already was, but I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how to feel about all of this. I reached out, my hand resting on his shoulder. I didn't know how to help either, I admitted. But I'm here now. I always have been, even when it seemed like I wasn't. There was a long pause before he finally nodded, the weight of our unspoken words lifting. We didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, it felt like we were on the same page. There was still a long road ahead, and healing would take time, but this was a start. We had faced the truth, and in doing so, we had finally begun to break down the walls that had kept us apart for so long. As we sat there, the reality of the situation slowly settled in. The car was wrecked, but we were safe. The night was still dark, but it no longer felt so oppressive. And as I looked at my wife, then at my stepson, I realized that sometimes the hardest things, the moments of discomfort and fear, were the ones that led to growth. We didn't need all the answers right now. What mattered was that we were finally ready to move forward together.